Welcome to Ill Communication. This week's show we have Dr. Stephen Levett, author of the book Freakonomics. We also have our economist, Roland. We have Dr. Sudhir Venkatesh, who infiltrated the Chicago gang. And finally, we have Arnie Duncan on my right, who is another statistician. So we'll start this off. Dr. Levett, could you give me the unifying theory of your book?
In my book, I go through a lot of small things, but none of them can really be called the theme of the book. Really, this book is about stripping a layer or two from the surface of modern life and seeing what is happening underneath. Like, what are the reasons and causes for all the little things you go through every day?
All right. I did read some of your work where you had done some research on abortion and crime statistics, and you received a very controversial review by a couple of your peers. Would you mind explaining the correlative effects that you found between abortion and crime rates?
Really, a big part of this book was changing the way you thought and keeping really everything in contending to be a factor in causing everyday things like the crime rate dropping. When I was going through, I found a huge correlation between abortion being legalized 20 years earlier than the crime dropping, because specifically, when people are born, they're not born with equal propensity to commit a crime. It's people born in poverty or any adverse situation are way more likely to commit crimes. And if you look at abortion being legalized 20 years earlier, you're cutting out a lot of those babies born into poverty and born into adverse situations because the mothers are now allowed to have abortions. And so these children, or aborted children who don't exist anymore, didn't grow up and didn't commit the crimes 20 years down the road, and therefore crime dropped. And looking at all the factors in there and weighting in abortion, I thought that was by far the biggest cause for the crime drop in the early 1990s.
All right, well, playing off of our theme of crime and overall violence and undergroundness, we have Sudhir Venkatesh, who infiltrated a Chicago-level street gang. And why Chicago? Why not go over to the 5 boroughs? Why would you choose that location?
Well, you see, I was getting my PhD in sociology at the University of Chicago, and so I was asked to hand out a survey in Chicago's poorest black neighborhoods. But it turns out that the names and addresses that I were given were all outdated and incorrect. So I ended up in a stairwell of a building that a bunch of crack dealers operated out of, interestingly enough. And, the gang couldn't decide what to do with me, so I was there for about 24 hours while they decided, and then they ended up setting me free. But as relieved as I was to be free, I was also curious about how the gang operated, because most people never really think about the daily life of ghetto criminals. And so I wanted to kind of see how the gang worked, and so I went to the gang leader, and he said that I could study the gang, and so I was with the gang for about 6 years.
Okay. And again, your safety, of course, throughout this was not a sure shot by any means, but I do understand that the data that you pulled back revealed a sort of pyramid scheme. Would you mind explaining what a pyramid scheme is and how it factored into the gang's organization?
Yeah, so the pyramid structure was pretty much how the gang was organized. The higher up on the pyramid that you were, the more power you had within the gang and the more money that you would make. And then the wider that the level in the pyramid is, the more people make up that level. So the directors of the gang are at the top, and there are about 20 of them. They also make the most money, and they're pretty much in charge of the gang. And then they're followed by the gang leaders, the offices within the gang, and then the foot soldiers. And then at the bottom are the rank and file, and they have the most people make up the rank and file, but they don't make any money at all. They are the ones who have to actually pay the gang.
All right, and finally, I heard that you were approached by one of the gang members who was about to die, and he gave you a significant amount of data about the gang's financial standings and their records over the past couple of years. What was the significance of that, and what did you learn from that?
Yes, the man's name was Booty, and he actually gave me quite a few notebooks about the gang, and they were a record of 4 years of the gang's financial transactions. They included sales, wages, dues, and then also the death benefits that were paid to the murdered gang members' families. And they showed that only the people at the top of the pyramid structures had high salaries, while people at the lower were making about less than minimum wage. So they also showed that within the 4 years that they covered, that the average gang member was arrested about 6 times and had 2 to 3 non-fatal injuries and had a 1 in 4 chance of being killed.
Oh, well, thank you for your eye-opening research, Sudhir. Back to Stephen. In your book, when I read it, I noticed you had a chapter on sabotage, more specifically cheating within the sumo wrestling ring. Would you care to delve into that?
Yeah, sure. If you look at the setup of a sumo wrestler's like tournament style, you see like a lot of incentives to cheat within it. And the only reason that this hasn't been changed throughout history is people have these ideas that sumo wrestlers are above this. It's too like holy of a sport for them to cheat. So to get into that, I went into the pure data of it, and I went and I looked at like people's records in different positions when facing the same opponents. So changing almost nothing in the match, there were vast differences in how they fared depending on whether or not like I needed to win or they needed to win or we both needed to win. So if you look at the pure data in a situation, you can usually see a lot of clarity into it as long as you like kind of get rid of your conventional wisdoms and stuff like that.
All right. Speaking of cheating, our friend Roland did some work within the Chicago system. Oh, Arnie. I'm sorry, Roland.
It's Roland for sure.
Arnie Duncan worked with the Chicago educational system in defining basically how teachers were cheating. How were the teachers cheating within the system?
The teachers used a variety of different means to cheat on the students' exams. Some went as far as to fill in answers for them and actually give them the answers out loud. Some teachers taught the class prior to the test based on the material that they had seen would be on the test, so that the kids would be familiarized with the information. Some changed answers after the children had left the room, and which actually was the reason that people started getting caught, was because there were trends in the numbers that were being changed were the same on a lot of tests. So that was the pattern that was found.
And what incentive would a teacher have to cheat? Obviously, students cheat all the time, mainly for grades. If you cheat and do well on a test, you get a better grade, you basically pass. But from a teacher's standpoint, why would they want to cheat on their student's test?
When the No Child Left Behind Act was implemented, and actually before, in some schools, these tests are being given to evaluate the schools based on how their students were progressing through the years. And a school that was considered a bad school, which had low test scores, would sometimes would have funds taken away from them, while schools that did well some teachers would end up being promoted, while the bad schools, the teachers would be passed on promotions and potentially lose their jobs because the funding from the schools were being taken away. So in some places, or in California, there were positive incentives as big as $25,000 bonus for big test score gains. So these positive incentives obviously would encourage a teacher to cheat, and it was also pretty easy to get away with. To actually detect a cheating teacher, you have to have really strong statistical evidence, which is hard to find.
And finally, to base off of that point, there was a relatively low number of convictions from the teachers that were caught by the statistical data. I saw that through using your pattern system, you found that many, many, many teachers were guilty of this, but a lot of the evidence was circumstantial. Why couldn't you convict so many of these teachers?
The difference in the test scores has to be statistically significant enough to prove that the teacher actually was cheating. A teacher could blame the difference in test scores on a situational factor, like the student wasn't having as good of a day, or the first test was harder than the second. There are a lot of ways that the teacher could make up excuses for this, and the statistical evidence must be really strong in order to prove it.
In one of the later chapters of your book, Stephen, you discuss the dangers of swimming pools and loaded guns, specifically in regards to children. Why would you say that a swimming pool is more dangerous than an actual firearm?
Well, based on pure data, just again, to be honest, looking at the way the public perceives risk is really interesting, because almost every time they're wrong about what is the most risky or the most dangerous position. You can't blame them. It's not like they're picking the wrong thing on purpose. There's a shock value to some events, and they get publicized much more by the media. I mean, how many firearm deaths do you see on the media compared to swimming pool drownings? But if you look at the data, swimming pools kill hugely more children around there, and it's a lot easier for a swimming pool to kill a child, because no parent would be that nervous that their child is going to swim out in the pool, or would lock the door to the pool every time. Whereas a gun will be kept in a cupboard out of a child's reach almost every time, locked in that cupboard probably. So, but just the fact that guns are meant for danger, they have extremely bloody death compared to a almost quiet swimming pool death. People just are irrational almost about their choice of risk.
All right, and touching on the topic of children, we have a statistician who deals specifically with the inner aspects of child naming and the raising of children. In your research, you found a vast amount of unique names compared to the normal names that people take. What was the significance of people taking unique names over the standard names?
Well, actually, if you look at the people who have unique names, they tend to be people who are kind of born in poor neighborhoods, who have low education. They have, typically they're teenage, younger women who have children living in really poor urban black neighborhoods. If you look actually until about the 1970s, these black names, very black, unique names, started emerging. But before that, there was an overlap between black and white names. This can kind of be traced back to the emergence of Afro-activism, namely the Black Power movement, where Africans sought to kind of assert their culture and accentuate African culture to fight the claims of black inferiority. One of the phenomena I actually study is acting white, where people in the black community frown upon people who have either white or deemed white attributes, people who are more intelligent, people who have white-sounding names. So giving a kid a super black name, a name that's very unique and not especially very unique compared to white names, makes you act black instead of acting white, which is more embraced in the African culture. Another kind of thing that unique names versus more common names is there's a transition between a higher socioeconomic status and a lower one. People who have a higher one tend to have more original names to begin with. But then if we look at the data, there's a pattern between names. People in the higher income have popular names in the 80s, such as Heather and Amber, and then later on in the 90s, the lower income, who typically many of the lower black African American people in urban areas, low economic status, white people have also emerged names such as Amber and Heather a decade later, and while those names actually dropped from the most common names in the high socioeconomic status of white people.
You speak about the cultural impact on names. How important is an actual name to a child? Does it determine their future? Is it negligible? Is it somewhere in between?
Well, names aren't necessarily a driving force behind whether or not a child is successful, but it is an indicator of what kind of environment a child was born into. If a child, for example, is named Temptress, it's a sign that the mother was uneducated, didn't really know like what the name meant. And so you have these children who are born into situations where they have low financial means. Their parents typically are uneducated or undereducated, don't value education as much. And so they tend to have a lower IQ. And there are examples of people who are changing their name, and people want to argue that changing your name will make you have a better position in life. A person whose name is unique, especially African American names such as Donnell or DeAndre, they tend to do less in interviews. Like if you look at a job interview application than people with normal names. So if people change their names, then it means there's been a kind of a trend of they do better. But that's more of a sign that the person themselves is more highly motivated, and this motivation is the driving force behind the fact that they do better, not necessarily that their changed name is what makes them do better.
One of the most popular debates in the parenting circles are nature versus nurture. And again, in psychological studies, you have the environment versus genetics. What's your take on this argument?
Well, basically, nature wins. This doesn't necessarily mean that genetics is necessarily the dominant factor, but it's basically your life is based on what you're born into, and there's not much parents can do after you're born. So a child who's born into a low-income family will most likely not get a higher education because those parents don't value education. Children who are born into higher financial means tend to have parents who have higher education, who value education more. So genetics is especially prevalent in adoption studies, where children who were adopted into a good environment still have lower IQs than would have been predicted based upon their adoptive parents. This shows that genetics do have a factor, but even so, later on, after the adopted children go on in their future to obtain jobs, they tend to make higher wages, which shows that there is a part of nurture that does affect, but it's basically what you're born into and what your genetics are that determines whether or not you'll be successful in life.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank our panel for showing up today, and we are running low on time. So once again, Dr. Stephen Levett's book, Freakonomics, is on the bookshelves now to check it out. And thanks everybody for coming. We'll see you next time.
Would any of the audience like?
Oh yeah. Audience questions, freebies. Anybody?
Very cunning. So we talked about, or you guys talked about the low-income families having unique names, but how can you explain like high-income people like celebrities name their children Apple?
You can't. No, a lot of times people, especially in a higher income, they want to name their child something unique, but not something blatant. Like, I mean, there's a difference between unique names and unique names that are obviously like of a low-income urban African name. You have Apple, and then you have like Shatid, which are completely different names. They're both very unique, but they're just a kind of a different standard. While these celebrities name them very unique names, it's not to the same extreme of the same like undereducated kind of naming of their children. So celebrities are weird. They name their kids Apple.
Any other questions from the audience? Well, I guess we're really done this time, so we will see you next week.